12 years ago, today's guest, Dave Dupont, left corporate America to embark on his passion to solve a simple problem. How can sports organizations provide tools to coaches, parents, and athletes and streamline the constant communication? TeamSnap has since been an innovator in how sports organizations use mobile technology to manage their business and communications. It is now used by 1 million teams and 24 million users in over 130 countries. In this episode, we speak with the founder and CEO, Dave Dupont. We talk about how he has scaled his business and he was able to successfully raise capital along the way. Let's jump right in. Dave, thanks for joining us today and look forward to having a conversation with you about your entrepreneurial journey. Would you mind starting off and telling us a little bit about your background and how you came to be the CEO and founder of TeamSnap?
Sure, John. Delighted to talk about that. And before I begin, thanks for having me. It's great to discuss my personal experience, and I really support what you're doing for entrepreneurs. So I'm an old school entrepreneur. I did it the old fashioned way, which is I actually worked for large companies for a while in the tech world, initially before business school, Schlumberger, and after that for about a dozen years with Hewlett-Packard in their PC and workstation businesses. So my trajectory was one that was perhaps more common in the past, but is the journey that I chose, and it's worked out well for me. And I'll make the comment before I begin that a friend of mine once said to me, entrepreneurs are not heroes, they're people that don't have a choice. And I think that resonates, certainly with me, and I think it makes sense for a lot of others as well. So let's talk about the formation of TeamSnap. So I was recruited from a large technology firm to help start up a computer peripherals company in Colorado, in Boulder. That's what brought me to Boulder. That company, Left Hand Networks, was ultimately sold to the company I used to work for, Hewlett-Packard. And I got the bug at that point. I found that I enjoyed the autonomy, I enjoyed the greater scope of responsibility, and frankly, I enjoyed the speed with which we could make things happen, the speed of decision making, the speed with which we could put solutions together. And that caused me to want to keep doing that. So TeamSnap is actually my third entrepreneurial venture, and it's the second one for which I've been the CEO. And really the story of TeamSnap itself is the story of scratching my own itch. I've been in technology for a long time. My son was on a lacrosse team. I was an assistant coach. And I just saw an opportunity based on my experience to make coordination and communication of team activities a lot easier. I did do some research. I talked to my peers, and I found out that the problem that I was seeing, lack of good management and communication, was one that my peers were experiencing, those who had kids on sports teams. And I ultimately found some web designers who had gotten a head start on the concept that eventually became TeamSnap. I convinced them to quit their day jobs and to take the leap and to form the company with me. That was in May of 2009, and it's been up and to the right ever since.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I was, I think, reading something along the lines of, north of 20 million users, I believe, use the TeamSnap platform today. Is that about accurate?
Yeah. No, we keep having to revise the numbers upwards. Now we're north of 24 million and continuing to grow. So we really did find product market fit from the beginning, and we're the leading platform for what we do around the world. We've expanded since our original focus on teams to clubs, leagues, and associations. And we've also expanded beyond providing think of it as communication and coordination tool, to providing access to the game experience and also providing access for athletes and their families to the products and services they need for the activities in which they're engaged.
Yeah, that's great. And today, as it stands, Dave, what is the size employee-wise of TeamSnap that you guys have built over the past?
Yeah, so we were approaching a couple hundred folks before COVID struck. And although our business is doing quite well, we have been, frankly, surprised and pleased by how quickly sports and our business have come back. Nonetheless, we were conservative at the beginning of the crisis, so we're below 100 folks now.
Okay, got it. And talk to us a little bit. I mean, the massive scaling of this business to 24 million users.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there that, different types of entrepreneurs. Some have small businesses that are more lifestyle businesses, and those are looking to really scale their business. And I
Mm-hmm.
know you've also done a lot of work, evaluating business plans over the years. I think you do some stuff with Stadium Ventures that we saw on LinkedIn here.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is the big difference between a business that's more of a lifestyle business and one that's going to scale to millions of users and hundreds of employees?
Yeah, I think the difference, and it could be hard to ascertain in the beginning, but there are some businesses that are just inherently local or inherently of a certain size that doesn't justify huge investment and a huge growth opportunity. So it all starts with an assessment of the market opportunity. And being big is not necessarily being better. It just means that you take a different approach to exploiting that kind of opportunity versus exploiting maybe a nearer to home or smaller opportunity. For better or worse, we chose an opportunity at TeamSnap that was a scalable opportunity. But in order to realize that, you have to make some trade-offs. Generally speaking, you need funds, you need to accelerate growth, and there are pluses and minuses to that.
Yeah, and certainly, yeah, as you mentioned, when you're trying to get the scale and critical mass, I'm sure there's a tremendous amount of learnings you've had through that journey. Would you mind sharing a few of those in terms of, if you're an entrepreneur listening to this and you're looking to scale your business, what are some learnings that they could get from your experiences?
Sure. I'll touch on a few of them. So the first is something I would say, regardless of what somebody is doing as they embark upon their professional career, entrepreneur or otherwise. And this comes under the heading of too much of a good thing can be a bad thing.
Hmm.
And I'll get to that in a second. So I'm often asked, what's the one piece of advice you would give somebody graduating from college, say? And my advice is nobody does it alone. And what I mean by that is to realize any significant opportunity, you're going to need help. Now, this is why I was saying a little bit earlier that too much of a good thing could be a bad thing. So it just so happens that my upbringing and even my first job out of college before business school really placed an emphasis on self-reliance. So for instance, this job I'm referring to with Schlumberger, I was what they call a wireline engineer. I was a guy who would go out and do surveys and blow things up in oil wells, basically oil well holes, in my case in Africa. And when I was doing that, I was by myself. I was working with a crew, but I was in charge of the crew, and things would invariably go wrong, and I just have to fix it somehow. I would have to get the job done. And that was a very strong life lesson. But in order to accomplish really big things, to build a company, you need more than just yourself, more than just a small team. You need a community. And it's never too early to begin building that community. And in fact, building upon that initial community. I can't tell you how many people have helped me on the journey of building TeamSnap, starting with section mates of mine from business school. There are 11 people that have invested in TeamSnap from my business school class. Not only have they been tremendously helpful, but it's been tremendously fun. It actually has strengthened relationships and led to a much better outcome than would otherwise be the case. Same thing in our community in Boulder. I talk to people all the time. I talk to people as I was starting up TeamSnap, and they have helped me tremendously. And by the way, it has to be a two-way street. I try to help them. So that's the first piece of advice I would pass along. Nobody does it by themselves. We as a culture like to glorify the leader, and that's fun to be seen as the guy who made everything happen. But behind every leader is a whole team of people, some of them within the company and many without.
Dave, how do you recommend that transition happen, where a lot of entrepreneurs do start like you did, and they start themselves only? Then as they look to scale and expand and they try to start and create that community, sometimes it's a very difficult switching of those gears between being a producer for yourself versus being a producer through others. How does that transition happen in a way that it would be most comfortable for people?
Yeah, I think a tactic you could say that I use is I I often approach people, even today, with requests for advice. I'm not looking for somebody to join my team. I will often reach out to somebody, and if I haven't connected with them before, I will often say, "Hey, I've got this idea. Know you're, interested in this particular topic, or you're an expert in this arena, or you have some reason to want to care, and I'd like to just talk about it with you and get your input." That is a low risk, low weight way to engage people. And the best way to bring people onto your team or to support what you're doing in any way is to get them to decide they want to do that. This is a tactic I use even for, like, it's different from building the community, but it's similar. Building sales in the early days, if or getting investors to participate in your company. The way I found works best is not to say, "Hey, will you buy this from me?" or "Hey, will you invest in my company?" It's more, and I think it's much more powerful to say, "Hey, I'd like to discuss this idea with you." And generally speaking, if you're approaching somebody with an ask, "I want you to do this for me," shields are up, right? You might be able to overcome that, but people are in that scenario are generally looking for a reason to say no. Whereas if it's a lightweight ask, then they themselves can, and this happened to me multiple times in the early years and continues to, if something you're doing is really interesting, it's more powerful if they decide it's interesting than if you try to convince them of that.
So you come back to discuss the idea versus I want you to do something and just let that conversation evolve.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you have to ask for something. Sometimes you don't have that luxury. But I found in general, taking a collaborative approach is much more powerful and builds much more commitment.
Can
And yeah, at some point you do have to have an ask if they don't volunteer. But generally speaking, I found that collaborative approach works extremely well.
Thanks for that. You talked about expanding, and I had a question on that because you talked about expanding, then you went to assessing market opportunity, and I just wrote down core with a
Yep.
question mark. So when you started your business and you were clear on what your core was, if you could speak to what that core was, and then as you started to add on to that core, how did you assess the market opportunity with the add-ons?
Yes, and I'm not sure we always made the right assessment, by the way, but let's talk about it. So the core problem that I set out to solve, you could reformulate as making sure everyone showed up at the right time, at the right place, with the right stuff for a team. Very simple task, if you will. And I knew from talking to a fair variety of folks. I mentioned talking to peers who had kids involved in sports. I talked to some other experts. I talked to potential investors, whether this is even the kind of thing they would be interested in investing in. And the feedback I got was there's likely to be something here, and it's likely to be pretty big. And it's not necessarily going to be easy, but it's likely to be pretty big. And the experience we've had over now, over 11 years has demonstrated that. Now, how do we assess expansion opportunities? So in our world, we started with the idea of focusing on teams, as I mentioned, and the opportunity that became clear pretty quickly is that teams belong to clubs, leagues, and associations. So there was an opportunity to expand there. And then it turns out that coordination and communication isn't the only thing that teams or sports organizations need. They need to do other things like provide coaching skills and development, for instance. Another one would be providing apparel, uniforms for the activities in which folks are engaged. So those all represent opportunities. And the prism through which we have, and this is going to be a function of every business, but we've tried to go back to what is it that we are going to continue to do, what's our core, to your point, and what is a natural extension of that core, and what should we do beyond that to strengthen our business. I mentioned that I was in the computer business, and the idea of of a total solution that incorporated third-party components was part of our thinking from the very beginning. We never thought we could do it all. We started with a very small piece, and we've been very disciplined about expanding beyond that small piece, that small core part of our functionality.
Can you give an example of something you said no to that somebody asked for, but you said, no, we're not going to expand in that way? And why did you say no? What were the principles involved in saying no to an expansion opportunity?
Yeah. By the way, I'm not sure my team would say, I say no enough. that's, I think, a key skill. But yeah, I can give you some examples. So we saw ourselves from the beginning as not just a platform for communication and coordination, but a widespread platform. And that meant we were going to have to be a mass market solution. We would benefit most from appealing to athletes and their families across sports even. And that's become a major strength of TeamSnap. Many of our members are using TeamSnap for multiple teams, multiple organizations. But an implication of that is that we should not be pursuing directly opportunities that are in subsets of our market, small subsets. So an example of that, I referred earlier to coaching skills and development. There are as many approaches to coaching skills and development as there are coaches almost. There are some leading platforms out there, but it's a very, very fragmented space. And the nature of coaching and skills development varies by the nature of the sport, the nature of the athlete, how competitive they are, and all those things. So that kind of, let's say, service or product doesn't really fit our concept of a mass market solution. It does fit as part of a total solution, and that's why we have, why we've made our platform open and enable organizations or enable third-party partners to connect to us, to utilize the data we have, to make their experience better for our customers. But we ourselves are not going to get into that business. I'll give you another example. There's a successful company out there that was purchased by Dick's Sporting Goods not long ago called Game Changer. Game Changer provides a really, really cool baseball and softball focused application that provides a pitch by pitch summary of the game in progress. So that's something that in theory TeamSnap could do. It's a natural extension of our base platform, but it's focused just on baseball and softball. It's for folks that are really statistically oriented and a good business in and of itself, but it starts to get kind of far afield from a company like ours that is focused on pretty much every sport, every team sport at least, and also focused in a broad fashion geographically. Game Changer's primarily a US focused company. So that's an example of, that could be interesting to do, but it'd be better to form a partnership there than it would to form a, to actually develop that product ourselves or to offer it ourselves.
Funny, Dave,
I can give you lots more examples, but those are two good ones.
It's funny, Dave, I have a daughter in softball. One already graduated, one's currently in softball, and they use Game Changers. So I know that app. And you're right, it's very specialized for the look, the feel, for the sport. I mean, it's softball or baseball. That's it. And what I have highlighted from what you had shared is one of the principles you look at for expansion is it a mass market solution? Game Changer was not a mass market solution. You knew there was an opportunity there, but you go, if it's not a mass market solution, I'm going to partner with somebody.
Right, right. Yep.
Dave, I want to come back just earlier in the conversation when you started talking about your learnings, and you said too much of a good thing is a bad thing.
Yep.
I just want to recircle back to that, because you talked about, nobody gets it done alone, and the opportunity to build a community. But it sounds to me like there's more behind that saying too much of a good thing is a bad thing. Can you tell us where that came from and some more behind that?
I think it came from realizing that, in a variety of ways, good qualities taken too far become inhibitors to success. So the example I was using was too much self-reliance makes you reticent to ask people for help. And a corner was turned for me. I think it really culminated in TeamSnap. It started earlier in my career, but frankly, not early enough, um, in my estimation. And I just decided when I started TeamSnap, I've had a good career. I know a reasonable amount, but I'm going to approach this situation humbly, and with the idea that there's a lot I don't know and a lot that people can provide. And that has been phenomenal. There are lots of other examples where too much of a good thing becomes a bad thing, right? Being too assertive. You got to be assertive to make things happen. But if you're too assertive, you're a jerk, to put it politely, and people don't want to work with you. I could come up with many other examples, and that's a good thing to keep in mind when we talk about qualities and what we want to strive for.
Yeah, I think specifically when you're talking about personality traits and your skill sets,
Right.
If you're very strong in a certain area and you decide, you're going to keep all that within yourself and not share that information with your team,
Yep.
you could put yourself in quite a big hole for sure.
Yep.
Talk to us about some other learnings you've had as you've grown your business. I'm sure through the beginning years of sitting on milk crates of a startup business to where you are today, you've encountered probably a couple of moments where you're kind of looking at what's in front of you and then the challenge, and you had to overcome it. Can you tell us a little bit about those instances? Because entrepreneurs.
Yeah. Let me just say the list is super long. So I'll just mention a couple of the ones that seem to me to be most important. So another one that frankly I'm very conscious of right now as we continue to scale the business, and that is that building an effective team is an ongoing process. And you should continually strive to have the best team you can possibly have at any given moment. So what that means, I've learned over the years, and I think this even applies to me. Industries, markets, and companies go through life cycles. I'm sure you guys are familiar with a product adoption life cycle, where you have early adopters and then you ultimately reach the mainstream and then things start to tail off. Companies go through a similar cycle. They start off small, they have to by definition, and if they're successful, they start to scale. Then often they reach some sort of plateau, and in many cases, in fact, in almost all cases, they start to decline. Now, the challenge of business leaders is to avoid those declines, but those are all different stages of business, and they demand different skill sets. And it turns out that as humans, most of us are not good across every one of those stages. And that's been something that I've had to keep in mind as I've grown TeamSnap. The skills and capabilities required to grow the business when it's 4 bozos, including Dave, in Dave's living room, that's a very different scenario from 40 people, very different scenario from 100 people growing a business that's in the tens of millions.
So when you talk about, most of us are not skilled enough or trained enough to go through all the different cycles of a company's evolution at that particular moment, are you suggesting that they need to continue to sharpen the saw to be able to adapt to those other areas, or is somebody better suited than them to kind of take the company through those different phases?
I think it's significantly the latter. Like none of us, just focusing on me. I'm a builder, I'm not a polisher, and I'm not a turnaround artist. So what I mean by that is on that curve I just described, that is starting with the inception of a company or a market for that matter, I really get a charge of and have the abilities and interest in growing a company. Now, I have peers that are very successful in taking a company that has, let's just say it's in the mainstream, and the art is growing or trying to grow by fractions of a percent to keep things going at that level. That this could be a company with tens of thousands of employees. That's a different skill set. And I don't believe that it's a matter of learning the skills, although you can do that to a certain extent. There's, I think, a challenge for entrepreneurs and for really everybody is to figure out where they fit. Do you like the chaos of the really early stages? Do you like the fun and excitement of the scaling and the still existing chaos, but not as much as in the early stages? Do you prefer a lot of structure and like working within that to really build upon something that's already big? Do you like turning around situations that are, where doom and gloom is reigning, and you can ride in and make a significant change? Those all require not even just different skills, but different personalities and different preferences. And I think it's absolutely key as an individual to recognize where you like to play, no pun intended. And as a leader of an organization, you need to recognize what you need at given moments in time.
Yeah, which goes all the way back to building an effective team and how critical that is along the journey. And I'm sure you've had the same situation too, where you're building your team. I'm sure have made great hires and some hires you wish you'd take back. As you've grown your team, I'm assuming at different stages of the growth and a different stage of the business cycle, your needs of who you're bringing on to that team vary. Not only your own skill sets vary, but the
very
needs
much
of bring on, right?
Very much, yeah. And this goes back to nobody does it alone. It's key to recognize what kinds of skills you need at what moments. So in the beginning, I'll give you an example. We at TeamSnap are really doubling down on analytical capabilities. Okay, so we're hiring analytics experts. We've been doing that for a little while. It would not have been appropriate for us to hire those kinds of people in the early stages of the company. Mm-hmm. We needed folks that could cover a wide variety of functions. Now we benefit from people that are experts in that single arena. And it's a critical element for us as we continue to grow and refine. But adding those folks too early would have been a bad call. And this points to something that that I think is, I put this under the general heading of courage, which is you've got to be courageous in identifying when people that were maybe critical in getting the business off the ground are not well suited for the next phase that you're entering into. It's not to say, and we have a habit of putting people into good or bad boxes. That's not sophisticated enough a way to look at it. Instead, we should be saying, where is this person best suited? Do the organization's needs conform to where they are in terms of those dynamics? And I found over time that you are best off liberating people who are not well suited for what you're doing moving forward to do something that's more consistent with where they are good.
It's so tough. I mean, when you're starting your business, they were what you needed right then and there.
Right.
And there's a really good book that talks about what got you here won't get you there. And the fact you need to evolve your team, but you have somebody that was there when you were on the milk crates in your living room building the business, and now you have to move on from them. And it's interesting you say the word, you're liberating them as opposed to terminating them or moving on.
Yeah.
That's a very difficult thing to do as an entrepreneur, because you invest in people, they invest in you, and the blood, sweat, and tears years. How have you handled that as you've grown your business?
I had some experiences early in my career that helped me adopt this attitude. I'll tell you one. When I was with Hewlett Packard, fairly early in my tenure there, I was well regarded pretty quickly, and my boss asked me what I thought about some of the folks I was working with interfunctionally. So I just gave him a quick rundown. To my horror, he passed that information along to some of the other managers in the division I work for. About 2 months later, this guy I had been working with on one of these interfunctional teams walked up to me, and this is in HP at the cafeteria. And when I saw him, I hadn't seen him because he was taken off the team, and I knew my boss had passed along my maybe not so positive comments. I didn't besmirch the guy, but I said something along the lines of, I think he's not entirely happy in this role, and my sense is he'd be better off in a different kind of role. Anyway, this guy walked up to me, and you can imagine, put yourself in my shoes. I'm thinking, oh crap, this is not going to be pretty. But instead, he walked up to me and he said, "Hey, Dave, I want to shake your hand. You called me you forced me indirectly to function or to focus on the fact that I wasn't really happy doing what I was doing." And that became a spur for me to look for other opportunities, and I found a job I love. So that actually early on was something that I kept in mind. And I've approached things that way when I've had to terminate people. And by the way, not everybody grows out of their ability to contribute. Some are capable of continuing to grow and develop, and you should strive for that, absolutely. But some are just not interested in doing so or don't have the capability to do so, and you should be open to that too.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I know a lot of entrepreneurs struggle. I know for myself, over the years, is you care so much about the people, and even when you know they're struggling, you want to get them to the other side of it. But you are right. Sometimes there's the relief in their eyes when they know, what, I wasn't happy, and
Yeah.
beyond the short-term pain of, I've invested a lot of years in this company, and I'm going to go do something else. On the other side of that is happiness, and I think people in your company respect that. And I know Team Snap, for example, has gotten a lot of recognition in terms of their culture over the years. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you've maintained your culture, especially now being maybe more remote?
Sure. Well, actually, our company was remote from the beginning, so we're a little different there. But I'd like to segue into this question by finishing up on the last one and say, one of the things that's become a little bit of a saying, and it's probably something we stole from somewhere else, which I'm totally fine with doing, by the way, when it comes to philosophies or approaches. But we have an expression internally, which is, it's being nice is not always kind. And what we mean by that is, if you truly have the interests of people at heart, then sometimes you'll say the tough things to them. And that applies even to, I think you'd be better off somewhere else. So it's being courageous enough to say tough things to people in general is going to be an enormous benefit to your organization. Now, talking about building a culture, and Team Snap, this is a big deal because we were a remote company from the beginning. Those web designers that I found to help me start the company were actually not in Boulder. They were in Portland, Oregon. And they had been part of a virtual web design company for I think it was a dozen years before I came along. So they were used to working remote. We decided it seems to be working pretty well. We'll try it out. Having a consistent culture has enabled us, in spite of being remote, to have a really strong company. For 3 years in a row, we were named among America's best company to work for. Now, let's talk about building a culture. And I have to admit, I didn't start off Team Snap with the idea that we're going to build a great culture. It was probably similar to the thoughts you or Rich had in starting your companies, which is, I want to build the kind of company, and I want to work with the kind of people that I feel good about, and that I can feel proud of. So I'd say that it starts with beliefs and values. And as I started Team Snap, I had certain beliefs and values that my co-founders shared that were a function of my upbringing and also what I'd observed in companies that I was part of. So one of those, this is just these are things that just really matter to me. One is respect for everybody at any level. That has lots of implications, like you show up on time for meetings, you listen to what everybody has to say, but at the same time, you respect other people's time. So everybody gets a voice if they have something to say, but that's not licensed to hold court. It's not licensed to take up everybody's time. So that goes a long way. Honesty. I've worked for really great organizations in this regard, and I've worked for others that weren't so great. I just think if people trust you, which honesty leads to, then you can accomplish an enormous amount. Some of the other ones that we focused on, authenticity, just being real. This is a funny story around this one. I told my family as I was starting Team Snap, I was like, I think this time around, I'm just going to be myself. I think I said something like, I'm just going to go with it. And I didn't mean I was going to be nasty or anything else, but I was not going to be overly, and I still use this word, corporate or overly polite. My daughter's response, by the way, was, oh no. But that authenticity has really worked out well. I mean, it's become a shared thing. And then there's accountability and initiative. Reward people for taking risks, expect people to take responsibility, and don't punish them if they fail, as long as they understand why and strive to do better. If they fail 5 times at the same thing, okay, that's a different discussion. But building those are beliefs, and a handful of them. And we could talk more about the contents of each one of them. I'll just end with one, or in this part of our conversation, with one observation, and that is, these beliefs should not just be articulated, they should be lived. So there are lots of stories within our organization where, sort of seminal moments when we decided to respect our values. An example would be when we started the process of years ago hiring a VP of engineering. In other words, replacing the person that was currently heading up engineering. And the way a lot of companies do it is they start the hiring process, they find somebody, and then they let the person that they're replacing know. It's much more difficult to tell the person that you're considering replacing that you're thinking of doing that and you're starting a process, but it's part of being honest and transparent. So this is a case where actually it was a person in my team that told me we needed to take that approach. So you're doing the right thing when your team members are hoisting you on your own petard.
Yeah, holding you accountable. And as an entrepreneur CEO, it's interesting to hear you say that, because some entrepreneurs and CEOs wouldn't welcome their team holding them accountable to the beliefs and values of the organization. They're the CEO. You shouldn't be telling me what I should be doing. But the fact that you have that open door policy plays into the culture and the belief system of the organization.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. It takes something for somebody to dispute the CEO, and I see it as a sign of success that I've established an organization where people can feel comfortable doing that.
You spoke about living the values. Outside of you being sure you're a good example of the values, and outside of sending out a pocket card or posting them on a wall in the remote offices, how do you go about keeping the values alive, particularly in a remote environment?
Yeah, I think the principles apply whether or not the environment is remote or not. And it comes down to recognizing and rewarding the right kinds of behavior and insisting upon it. So in situations where people take initiative, reward them. When people demonstrate authenticity and honesty and respect, do so. I'll give you an example. Recently, we had a hackathon. So, very common phenomenon in the software development world. A hackathon is where you let engineers, developers, just work without supervision. Often it's over multiple days on some project that they want to work on. So we had one a few months ago and gave no direction at all. Just said, you guys know what we're trying to accomplish as a business. Go ahead and just have fun and start coding some things that we're not currently pursuing. One of the product features that came out of that was health check. Health check is a scan test, screening test that we've all experienced in these days of COVID, where if you go to a clinic or you go to some establishment, you're often stopped at the door and folks will ask you, do you have a fever? Have you been in contact with anybody with COVID and all that? So that's the screening test. We actually incorporated that into our application so that sports organizations, clubs, leagues, and associations could have their athletes have the tests administered at home. So it saved labor for them. They didn't have to have somebody asking the questions. And secondly, they could avoid having somebody that had symptoms or was in danger of having COVID-19. We through this feature, the sports organization could avoid having that athlete show up at the field, the rink, or the court. So that feature was developed through initiative, right? It was the team that came up with the idea, that executed it, and they were rewarded for doing so. There was the psychological reward of seeing that idea turn into a major feature. Now about 50% of organizations with TeamSnap are using Health Check. We've already had, in the space of like 6 weeks, 6 million screens administered through this feature. So that's an example of initiative. When somebody is doing something you want them to do, recognize it and reward it. And they're likely to do something like that again.
In the remote environment, and it's really cool to hear how TeamSnap was remote from the beginning when a lot of companies are now learning how to be remote.
Yep.
And I don't want to touch specifically on this recognition component, but in general, how do you communicate with hundreds of employees in a remote environment? Because this isn't new. This isn't something you started doing since March of 2020. You've been doing it for practically a dozen years. What are some of the tips and tricks that entrepreneurs who've now just gone remote can maybe take from this conversation?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. First, you can never communicate enough. That's true whether an organization is remote or not. Just look for opportunities to have two-way communication at the individual level, at the group level, at the company level. So we doubled down on communication from the very beginning. And then take proactive steps to counter what could otherwise be an us versus them kind of situation. So TeamSnap actually does have a physical headquarters in Boulder, Colorado. And on any given day in normal times, which we're not in normal times, but on any given day, something like 20 people show up. So it could be easy for the folks in the Denver office to be the us and everyone else to be the them. And we have gone out of our way to identify policies and procedures that make everyone feel included. So a simple one is in the early days when video conferencing first became available, we would have video conferences with everybody that was in Boulder would be in a conference room, and everyone that was elsewhere would be where they would have their own Hollywood Square, just like us today. What we decided to do 5 or 6 years ago was, even if everyone was in the office but one person, we would still all jump on our individual computers. We'd all have our Hollywood Square, and that has a phenomenal effect of leveling the playing field, because I suspect you guys and many of your listeners have been in situations where they're trying to horn in on a conversation that's taking place in a conference room from afar. It's pretty hard to pull off.
Very difficult.
Yep. So that's
you
just an example.
You almost feel like you're not part of the meeting, right? Even if there's 80 people that are remote and 20 that are in the room, the conference call is going to join the room. Everybody's talking to each other about what they're going to do for lunch, and you put yourself on mute and you sit there.
Yeah, exactly. And getting a word in edgewise when you've got 4 or 5 people in a conference room talking is challenging, especially if I'm in the conference room talking.
Yeah, no doubt. Dave, you've had some experience, a lot of experience, raising capital for your business. And I know, again, I'm not 100% sure, what other experiences you've had in the capital raising game for other entrepreneurs. But if there was a business that was looking to raise some capital to scale and grow their business, what would be 1 or 2 pieces of advice you'd have for them based on your experience?
Yeah. So the first thing is, make sure that your business is one that's appropriate for capital, because many aren't. You have to have a certain market size to even justify taking on capital, and you have to have the ability to exploit that market relatively quickly with capital, because your typical investor is not interested in seeing the fruits of their investment, say 3 decades from now. So you've got to first of all have an idea, a concept, a business venture that is worthy of being invested in. Then that leads to the second step, which is there are different kinds of investors for different kinds of companies and different stages of companies. So investors are not one size fits all. Some investors are interested in social impact. Some investors are interested in their local communities. Some investors have a very different risk-reward profile from others. In the early days, generally speaking, it's fruitful to look to friends and family to support an idea. But then after that, typically one looks at venture capitalists, and specifically early stage venture capitalists who have a high risk-reward profile. They generally like to invest, that particular kind of investor, in something that has a really high upside opportunity. A lot of risk, but a really high upside opportunity. And their expectation is 1 out of 10 is going to be a home run. and maybe 3 out of 10 is not going to result in a base hit, to use a baseball analogy.
Sure.
As a company develops and scales, different kinds of investors start to be more appropriate. If you're north of 25 million or so, depending on the business, the private equity world, and more specifically the growth equity world, might be the appropriate investor. And another kind of investor is strategic investor, where what you're doing is particularly important to a certain kind of company that makes products or services. So those are all considerations. Know who to go after is kind of the heading under which everything I just said comes after. Know your market and the market opportunity first, then know whom would be interested in funding what you want to do for where you are right now. And then I'll take a pause and allow you to ask some more questions. But the next step is then to approach the appropriate kinds of investors.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, before anybody's going to get an investor, they have to have a business plan that they show. And I know you're very adept at reviewing business plans. Can you speak to the most common, maybe 3 mistakes that you see in your evaluation of business plans that every entrepreneur should know? Every entrepreneur listening may not make these 3 common mistakes because they heard what you have to say next.
Yeah. The most common mistake, and I'm just blown away by this, is not doing the work. And this is what I mean by that. I'm amazed by folks who come up with an idea and then just start working on it. Pour money into it, et cetera. And we all know folks like this. And this happens quite a bit in the technical arena, where somebody's come up with essentially a new mousetrap, new approach. And this goes back to seeking help. I cannot urge enough the importance of getting reactions to the concept. And I know that some entrepreneurs are afraid of somebody stealing their idea, but a much worse, in my opinion, outcome is not validating the idea in the first place. So you spend, say, a year working on it, and it turns out that there really is no market for what you're doing, that the assumptions you had were not accurate. And the reality is that the great majority of businesses start off with the wrong idea. In the entrepreneurial world, it's a cliche to pivot to something else. In our case at TeamSnap, we didn't pivot a lot because we did the work up front. I validated the market need. We did tweak some things, like one of the things we discovered pretty early on, 6 months in, is we needed to focus more on the youth market because that's where the numbers were, and there are some specific requirements there in terms of youth sports. But in general, the first step is just make sure there's an opportunity for what you want to do. And I'll get out there and talk to people and talk to customers, not just to validate what you're doing, but to refine the idea. So that's the first thing.
Got it. Validate market need.
Yeah.
That would be number 1. What would be number 2?
Validate and refine. Because if you're talking to people in an open, I used to work for a CEO who said, you should engage in conversations early on with big ears. And what he meant by that is listen a lot. Talk about your ideas, but then listen to what people have to say, not just to validate what you want to do, but to refine what you're thinking of doing. It'll be more powerful. And I'll tell you, nothing is credible for investors as you being able to say, I talked to X number of potential customers and we learned Y and Z. That's a super powerful thing. So that's the first step. And then, the ingredients of a business plan one can find online, but I think you have to go through the basics, right? What's the market opportunity? What's the portion you think you can get with your initial product? How much is it going to cost you to develop that solution? It's sort of like the typical things. What is the market? What is the product you're thinking of doing? What is the competition for whatever solution you're thinking of introducing right now? How does what you're doing compare to that? And one of the things you have to show is what you're thinking of doing is a lot better than what people are doing today to address that specific need. Those are some of the things that a business plan has to incorporate.
That's great. So I got validate market need and refine. research your competition and differentiate from what your competition is providing. And you see in the business plans you've reviewed, not enough of those two things are happening.
Indeed, yes. It's easy to put together spreadsheets. It's easier to just, come up with a forecast. It's easy to identify, at least initially, the kinds of people you're going to need. But those are all dependent in terms of success on starting with the right market opportunity, with a differentiated product, with something that's clearly going to be advantageous in the customer's mind compared to what they are using today. And it has to be something that's not just ideally a nice to have, but a must have.
Dave, the question that Rich was asking you is, mistakes in business plans as you're going to get investors. As we kind of wrap up our conversation here, what would be one, big mistake or learning that if an entrepreneur is listening to this in general, you would say, don't do this. I did this, and I'd recommend you stay away from making that same step that I took.
One of those, if I knew then what I knew now, I would have either saved a bunch of money or I would not have turned over a really good employee. What is one of those lessons?
If I knew then what I know now. One of the one that occurs to me is how much potential investors will discount what you say about the size of the market opportunity, and what the difference in value placed upon something that is investigated or real, or ideally even in process, versus an idea. So I've been, and I didn't realize this until later. I think an investor told me, Dave, when you talk about your forecast for this ancillary business you haven't yet invested in, I don't pay any attention to that at all. It's just throwaway. And I could have saved a lot of, it was worth me thinking about those things and maybe pointing to them briefly, but it wasn't worth developing a whole plan around because it wasn't credible in the eyes of the investor. So I guess it comes down to, and this is a really basic maxim, but I think this is an important lesson, which is less is more. Focus on the key things that make you different. And there's always going to be exciting possibilities beyond that. And you might point to them in a very lightweight fashion, but you're better off just focusing on, this is what we're doing. This is where we have investigated thoroughly. This is where we're having a measure of success. That's where you should put all the wood behind the arrow.
It's very interesting because it ties to what you talked about a little bit ago as well. Did you do the work?
Yeah.
Very simple to say, if this works and we only get 1% of the market share of North America, we're going to be $1 billion company.
Right.
Which the investor looks and throws that away and says, okay, we haven't done anything. But if you actually go to work and beta test the marketplace and give smaller pieces of evidence, but they're factual, and you've done the work to
exactly
qualify them, it carries more weight.
Exactly, John. And just as I said earlier, it's good to approach conversations with customers and investors in a collaborative fashion. It applies here too, because maybe given a hint of an opportunity, it is far better for you for somebody to be thinking, okay, they've got this part nailed, and I don't think they've actually thought through, but there's this bigger other opportunity to seize. If they came up with the idea, it's much more powerful for them.
Yeah, great. Well, Dave, really appreciate your time today. A lot of content and information and learnings here that I think are phenomenal, that people are going to get a lot from. So I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure. Great questions. As you can tell, I always like talking about this stuff. So this has been a fun hour.
Appreciate you sharing your learning. Thank you.